Okay, so today we will talk about how to create a game with multiple characters using an array list. So the example we'll look at today is creating a game where there are multiple enemies that can be spawned, and there can be indefinitely many enemies. Additionally, the character will be allowed to shoot pellets at the enemies to make them go away. So there will be an array list of pellets as well. Okay, so let's take a look at what this will look like first. We get a sense of what we're working with. Okay, so here's our main character, our hero, walking around. Now, I've just set it so that when you press a key, random enemies will pop up on the screen and bounce around. Obviously, you can have different conditions for the enemies popping up. So the more I press this key, the more different enemies pop up. And as you can see, they all bounce off the walls, and they're all deadly. If I were to touch any of them, game over. Alright, so now that we have a sense of how that works, let's see how the shooting might work. So currently I have it set up so that when I press enter, little pellets are shot out and are able to disable the enemies. Alright, so let's see how that works. As you can see, there are additional instance variables called enemies and pellets, which keep track of the enemies and the pellets. This means that in the constructor of the game, these need to be initialized as well. There's additional work that we have to do in the update method as well. First, let's look at the code for spawning enemies. As you can see, if a certain key is pressed, we will add a new sprite to the enemy's array list. Now, as you can see, this is a slightly different version of the sprite constructor than what we've been using before. There are more arguments. So let's take a look over at the sprite.java file. Sprite.java, it now has two different constructors, when before it only had one. So this is the original constructor, which takes in an initial xy coordinate, a radius, and a file name. This is an overloaded constructor, so it's an alternate constructor that takes in all the same arguments, but also initial velocities and for x and y. Along with this, we have two new instance variables, xv and yv, which keep track of the velocity in the x direction and the y direction. There's one new method as well. There's a new method in the sprite class called public void automove. So automove is a very useful method that will allow enemies and pellets and objects like that to move on their own without being continuously updated from the main class. So as you can see, every time this is called, x and y are incremented, and this also takes care of the bouncing. If the x's or y's go outside of bounds, then the velocity will be flipped. So this takes care of the behavior of the enemies, which all move and bounce off the walls without having to check constantly for each object. So if you look back in the game class, and specifically in the main method of the game, or in the update method rather, you can see that we have a new for loop. This for loop goes through each enemy in the enemy's array list, and it calls automove, which will automatically move that specific object, which means that if it's at a boundary, it will bounce, etc. Additionally, inside this loop, we check if the hero and the enemy are touching, and if so, we move the hero off the screen. And then we also draw each enemy. So this is how we do the movements of the various enemies. You can get a little more creative and have the enemies do something a bit more interesting. Perhaps, would you be able to do intelligent enemies that move towards the hero? That's a challenge for you. Okay, let's take a look at the pellets. So this for loop is going to handle the pellets. Here we iterate from I equals 0 to pellets.size. So we're going through the list of pellets. And for each one, again, we're calling automove. Now, what's different about the pellets is that when each pellet is created, it's created with a x velocity of 0. So they don't move side to side at all. They just move straight up. but you can obviously change that according to your needs. We also draw each pellet, and then we check for each pellet. We have another nested for loop inside of here that goes through all the enemies, and if that pellet and an enemy are touching, we remove that enemy. Then we call j minus minus. I'll leave it as a challenge for you to remember. Why do we have to remember to decrease j after we remove an enemy from j? Okay, and then additionally, if a pellet goes out of bounds, we remove that pellet so the pellets don't just keep flying off infinitely into space and we don't take up too many resources. Okay, so that's about it. It's pretty much the only additions. Just as a review, we had a couple new variables in Sprite. We have the x velocity and the y velocity. We have an overloaded secondary constructor. We have a new method, auto move, which allows the enemies and the pellets to move semi-autonomously. And then we have these two array lists of enemies and pellets. We add new objects to each of these array lists when certain conditions are met. So for shooting a pellet, it's when the enter key is pressed, and for spawning enemies, it's when the Q key is pressed. Obviously, you can have different conditions for your needs. And then we add a new sprite to each of those with the correct parameters. This logic in here makes sure that the enemies have the appropriate behavior, they move, and they are deadly, so to speak, to the hero, and then the pellets are deadly for the enemies. So just one more time, let's just see what it does. I'm going to spawn a bunch of enemies here. Okay, get rid of them pretty efficiently. Pretty fun, right? So obviously your job is to be a little more creative, and you can take some of these ideas, but I want to see some of your own creative juices flowing and create something really interesting. All right, good luck.